Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's South Carolina Writers Workshop webinar presentation with Susan Breen. Today, Susan will be talking about plotting essentials, 5 things you need to know to plot your novel or short story. I'm Trilby Plants, past president of SCWW. I have a couple of housekeeping items. I sent everybody who'd signed up a handout from Susan this morning. It will be available after the broadcast on our YouTube channel in a link. If you lose the webinar, just sign in again with the link in the email you received. You can ask questions using the chat feature. You have to enable it. It's the little icon on the left of your screen. It looks like a little quotation in a cartoon. Just type in your question and click send, and Susan will answer either at an appropriate time or at the end. Are there any questions about how to get going on this? Okay, seeing none, let's get started. Does plotting sound imposing? Susan Breen will give us 5 tips to help master the essentials of plotting stories and novels. Susan has been a journalist and has published many short stories and a novel, The Fiction Class. She teaches fiction writing classes for Gotham Writers Workshop in Manhattan. Susan's new mystery series featuring Maggie Dove, a Sunday school teacher turned detective, will be published by Random House this year. The first one will be out in June, and the second will be out in October. Here's Susan Breen.
Hello, thank you so much for joining me today. Plotting is something that a lot of writers have trouble with, and I certainly had trouble with. The first novel I ever wrote, I revised 42 times. And basically, it's because I kept replotting the novel. And it took me 7 years, and it never was published, but I learned a lot about plotting. I certainly learned what not to do. So over time, and as a teacher at Gotham Writers, I've spent a lot of time teaching about plotting, and that's what I want to talk about today. I have to say this is my first webinar, so I hope it's all going well, and I apologize in advance if my dogs start to bark. There doesn't seem to be anything I can do about that. Okay, so let's talk about plotting. And the first essential thing to know about plotting, I believe, is that it starts with character. So when plotting a story, the first thing I like to do is take a step back and think about who the character is, who you'll be writing about. And that's what I sent the dossier out today for, to begin thinking about that. So let me start with that. And this is how I would go about plotting a story. And I filled out a dossier for this character, so I'll just start there. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that our character is going to be a 50-year-old woman. What will we name her? I decided on the name Madeline Snow. Where does she live? I decided she'd live in New York because I live in New York and in a suburb. And I decided that she'd be a caretaker for her mother, who is a lovely woman, but is a demanding woman as well. Now I want to think a little bit more about Madeline, our protagonist, and you'll see that on the dossier I gave a number of things that you might want to ask about her. Is she right or left-handed? I said right-handed. Her education, I think she has a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and she works as a teacher. Her family, as we've said, she's close to her mother, and she's a caretaker with her. Where does she live? She lives with her mother in a house in Ossining. Ossining, if you don't know it, is a town which is in Westchester in northern Westchester. And a significant thing to know about Ossining is that there's a jail there called Sing Sing. Okay, and then I continue. We don't need to go through all of these things now, but I kept asking myself questions about her. I like to know, what do my characters like to read? In this case, I decided that she would like to read Jane Eyre because, for one thing, I like to read Jane Eyre, and because, for another thing, I think that suggests she's a somewhat romantic person. Jane Eyre herself was stuck in a job that in a place, particularly when she was young, she wasn't happy about. And so perhaps our Madeline Snow also feels that way. How does she dress? I assume she's a conservative dresser. If she's a teacher, she might worry about running into her students after school. Is she religious? Yes, I said she's a Presbyterian, she's religious. What type of car does she drive? A Subaru. What type of music does she like? And I said she liked hip hop. Now, where this came from, I don't know. Here I am thinking about this woman who seems fairly mainstream to me, even bordering on the conservative side. And then all of a sudden it pops into my head that she likes hip hop music. So then I say to myself, okay, where does that come from? And I love it when you surprise yourself when you're thinking of characters. So why does she like hip hop music? Because she seems to me like somebody who I would have thought like Rachmaninoff. So I begin to think more about her, and I say to myself, what hobby does she have? What does she do in her spare time? And something that I thought about is that, what if she does volunteer work with a child whose father is in jail at Sing Sing? There are mentor programs that you can belong to. This is a good-hearted woman. Perhaps she's bonded with this child. We'll say he's more than a child. Maybe he's 13 years old, and he likes hip-hop music. And because she's taken to listening to this music with him, she likes it as well. I like that because I like it. We all are mixtures of contradictions. And this to me is a nice contradictory detail about this character. Now, so far what we've been doing is building up really superficial details about the character, not yet going into the heart of who she is, but trying to come up with some idea of what sort of person she is. And now we go to the deeper questions. And this is really where it comes back to plot. Knowing what we know about this woman who's a good-hearted person, who's taking care of her mother, who's living perhaps a somewhat prescribed life, what might we say that she wants? And what it seems, and who likes Jane Eyre? And what it seemed to me that she might want is to find love. Finding love is a great quest. So many people are looking to find love in so many different ways. So we'll say, all right, what is this? What does Madeline want? She wants to find love. What is she afraid of? She's afraid that she'll live and die without ever finding true love. And so this desire, this quest is now what is going to fuel the plot. So do you see how we started off in just 5 minutes? We start off with nothing. Now we have a character who wants something. And her wanting this is what is going to fuel the story. So part one of my 5 plotting essentials is to come up with a character who interests you, who wants something. I have to take just a minute to think about Maggie Dove, who is the protagonist of my mystery series. I came to Maggie Dove in a similar sort of way. What I knew about her was that she was a woman who had lost a child. And she was sort of alone in the world, except that she does belong to, that she lives in this small village and is a very happy member of this village. She has a lot of friends, but she's been grief-stricken now for these 20 years. And so she really doesn't, she's perfectly content being grief-stricken. She doesn't want to move past that. She loved her daughter. She doesn't want to heal. But she has this terrible neighbor, and this neighbor wants to cut down the oak tree that's on her lawn. And one day she wakes up and lo and behold, the neighbor is dead under this oak tree. This is bad enough. But it turns out that the person who is accused of the murder is her favorite Sunday school student, who is also her daughter's fiance. Now Maggie is going to do anything she can to figure out who committed this murder, because she cannot have this man accused of the crime. You see, though, how the plot comes out of the character. Because I knew who Maggie was, I knew the very thing that would push her button. And so that brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is that you have a character, and you have a character who wants something. And now, in order to get the plot in motion, you need to have an inciting incident. So the second part of the plotting essentials, or two, is to have an inciting incident. And by that I mean something that sets the plot in motion, something that happens to get things moving. If you think of The Wizard of Oz, the thing that gets that story moving, of course, is that a tornado comes. If you think of all the different things that might happen, well, something that happens a lot is that a new person might move to town. A stranger comes to town. Alternatively, it might be you get a letter in the mail, or you get an email saying that you've inherited $1 million, or you've lost $1 million, or you're about to be sued, or you go to the doctor and you find out that you're pregnant, or you find out that you have I don't know, that you have 3 months to live. That would be a more depressing story. But the key thing is that something has to happen to get the story in motion. You can't just, or you can, but it won't be too exciting a story if you just have things just sort of going along with things happening randomly. So if we go back to our Madeline Snow, who's looking for love, and we say to ourselves, what would be a good inciting incident for that? I would say that a good thing would be if maybe this kid that she mentors, and let's give him a name because it's always good to give people names. Let's say his name is Jason. Let's say that she finds out, and let's see, today is March 1st. Let's say she finds out, this is taking place in March. Let's say she finds out that on March 7th, his father is going to be released from jail. And Jason is worried because he hasn't seen his father for a while. And he wants Maggie to come with him when he sees his father. So immediately we have something happening, right? We have our inciting incident, and we know that this is the story. This is really what's going to kick the story into gear. Now we know that something is going to happen. Now we have to think a little bit about who Jason's father is. And that brings me to the next thing. And I guess I should say, if anybody has questions as I'm going on here, please feel free to interrupt or to ask a question. So second thing is the inciting incident. She's going to go to this meeting and meet Jason's father. And now we have to think about what he's like. And this brings me to the third thing, which is obstacles. Stories and plot are about obstacles. And I can think right off the bat that if you are a romantic sort of woman and you're about to meet a man, we'll make him attractive, because why not? And you're about to meet a man who's just gotten out of jail, right there you have an obstacle. Right there you have something that is going to cause conflict. So there are usually several types of obstacles that can come up in a story, and really you want both types coming up. The first type is the internal obstacle. What has been stopping Maggie all along? Maggie, sorry, I'm getting my M's confused. What has been stopping Madeline all along from finding love? Maybe she has trust issues. Maybe when she was a young woman, she was engaged and her fiance left her at the altar. This is all stuff that goes into thinking about the character. But the key thing is that you want your character in the story to have internal obstacles. And then, of course, you want to have external obstacles. And in this case, I think that having somebody come out of jail is a big thing to grapple with, both on his part and her part and Jason's part, the kid that she's befriended. So we want to think probably a little bit about what sort of person Jason is. And I think because I don't see this as a horror story, I don't think, I think if Stephen King were writing the story, he might make him a different sort of prisoner. But I'm going to say that he wasn't in jail for anything violent. I'll say that he was in jail because he was accused of burglary. And so a nonviolent crime. And of course, he said he was innocent. And let's say he serves 6 months. I don't know. Thankfully, I have no personal experience with the criminal justice system, but that seems to me reasonable. Okay, so this man is getting out of jail and she meets him. And of course, immediately she feels this connection with him. We'll say that perhaps he's a very kind and gentle man, and he's suffered, and her heart goes out to anybody who's suffered. And plus, she's attached to his son. And so she finds herself almost against her will being drawn into a friendship and maybe even a romance with this Jason. Now, it can't go smoothly or we won't have a story. And unfortunately, stories are about obstacles. They're about problems. If you have a character who wakes up one day and decides he wants $1 million and he inherits $1 million that day, that's a very nice thing for that person, but unfortunately, it doesn't make for a great story. So we have to have our character struggle. And in this case, I would say that a good source of struggle could be Madeline's mother. And that brings me to the fourth part of my plotting essentials, and that is having an antagonist. When I talk about an antagonist, I mean that you should have somebody who stands in the way of your character getting what she wants. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be an evil person. I mean, it could be Hannibal Lecter, but it doesn't have to be. It could just be somebody whose interests go against your own, which in this case, the mother might be a good source of tension. We will assume that the mother is protective of her daughter and perhaps is suspicious of this man who just got out of jail. Her mother may also really want her daughter taking care of her, her, and is not looking for her to go off and take care of someone else. And so there are any number of reasons why this mother may be coming between Jason and Madeline. Again, any questions about this? Okay, so you see how the story is taking place. We have a character who wants something. Then we have the inciting incident. Then we have the increasing conflict. And that's what's going to happen is the tension is going to get greater and greater. Madeline is struggling with the fact that her own concern about Jason, and now we maybe have her mother getting involved. And maybe her mother is saying, is coming up with roadblocks, or maybe she is Googling him and saying, this man is really bad. I don't think you should get involved with him. And we can think of all sorts of things that might be happening, and they're going to be getting worse and worse and worse. And then imagine if Madeline's mother is robbed. How bad would that be? Let's say Madeline's mother is robbed and she blames Jason. Jason swears he had nothing to do with it. He had nothing to do with it. And Maggie's torn, and Madeline's torn. Does she trust Jason, who she's come to love, or does she trust her mother, who she's always loved, but who she recognizes may not be entirely neutral in this situation? So do you see how things are getting worse and worse? And what we're trying to do is put this character under as much pressure as we can. We're really trying to make Madeline make choices. Okay, so now we get to the fifth part of the plotting essential, and that is that we get to the ending. And endings are hard to write because, for one thing, by the time you get to the ending, particularly if you're writing a novel, you're tired. You want it to be done. You want the novel to be published and be done. So a lot of times people will spend much more time working on their opening chapters than their final chapters, just because there's a tiredness factor involved. But also, they tend to be emotionally grueling. Particularly if you're writing the way I'm talking about, and you're really trying to tap into your readers, your characters' emotions, by the time you get to the conclusion, it can be very draining. You've come to love this character probably, and you're hoping it all turns out right, but you don't know. So there are four ways that stories can end. One way is to have a happy ending. The character gets what she wants, and she's happy. In that case, it might be that Madeline's mother confesses that actually she planned the robbery herself. It had nothing at all to do. She was trying to frame Jason. She's very sorry. Jason is vindicated. And he proposes, they get married, and everything works out really well. That might be a good, that would be a very happy ending, and it might work well for a romance or just a generally happy story. So one way for a story to end is she gets what she wants and she's happy. The second way is she doesn't get what she wants. In this case, Madeline may realize that, in fact, horrible as it is to admit, her mother is right, that Jason really is a thief, and she has to deal with that fact, and she has to break up with him. And you can imagine this would be a really sad story. And she and her mother, the final scene might be Madeline and her mother going to the diner together and talking the whole thing over. Sometimes stories have sad endings. There's nothing you can do about that. You have to go with what feels right to you, or what feels right for the character, I guess. The third thing that happens, and this I think happens with a lot of stories, is that she doesn't get what she wants, but she decides she didn't want it. So here it might be that maybe Madeline never figures out if Jason is a burglar or not, but she decides that, you know what, she actually has a happy life. She likes having the son in her life. She likes him being a part of her life. Maybe she doesn't want to marry him, but she wants to be friends with him. She has a full life with her mother, and she's gonna adapt to that. And this, I think, is in many ways the most realistic ending. Oftentimes, by the time we get what we think we want, it's maybe not exactly what we thought we wanted, but it's fine, and we can deal with it. And so that's another way it could go. And the fourth way it can end is she gets what she wants, but she realizes that she doesn't really want it. And in this case, it might be she goes ahead, she marries Jason, and then she finds out that he is a thief. And now she's got to deal with that, kind of like the end of The Graduate, if you ever saw that, where he tries and tries to marry this woman and then realizes that he's not entirely sure he wants to marry her. Another way it could end, and I just think this would be kind of fun, is if it turns out that Jason has a twin brother. And if, in fact, Jason wasn't the thief at all, but his brother was the thief. I don't know where that would fall into precisely in the four. Maybe it's a happy ending. It's a good idea to test out all four endings when you're writing a story, because what often happens is we tend to go to the first ending that comes up, which is often the easiest ending. Maybe it's the thing, maybe you've watched a lot of TV shows, and as we all have, and it seems that this is the way they often end. So it's almost always the case that the first ending you come up with is the wrong one, and you want to press yourself to think of something more imaginative. Now, those are my 5 plotting essentials, but I have a 6th thing I want to throw in, and it relates to the beginning. But I didn't mention it at the beginning because quite often people become obsessed with beginnings. I've had several students who spent years working on an opening chapter, and this is no good. You need to move on. And so I like to really not think about the beginning until I get to the end. But when you get to the end, and usually, to tell you the truth, usually you can't figure out what the beginning is. Of course, now the phone's going to ring. Usually you can't figure out what the beginning is until you get to the end. When you get to the end and you go back to the beginning, a thing that happens a lot is that people tend to start the story too early into the story. So let's think about Madeline for a moment. Say I've decided to go ahead and write this story about Madeline. Then I might, where might I start the story? Well, there are a number of things that are going to happen. Madeline is going to wake up that day. She's probably going to brush her teeth and take a shower. She's going to have breakfast. She's going to look out the window. Maybe she's going to think about the dream she had that night. She's going to, maybe she's going to take her dogs for a walk. Maybe she's going to go then visit this boy who she's been mentoring. And then when she gets there, she's going to notice a sign on the wall saying that there's a meeting for mentors or something. These are all things that would probably legitimately happen to your character during the day. But the trick of it is to not start when she's waking up or when she's going about her normal humdrum business, but to start closer to where the story is actually going to begin. So if I were writing this story, I would start with her arriving at the jail probably, and I would have her looking at the jail and thinking, and it gives you a good opportunity to describe what the jail looks like, and thinking about Jason or about this boy, and then reflecting on that. That gets you going in a really active way. If you give a reader a story that starts with somebody going into a jail, I guarantee you they're going to read that before they read a story about somebody waking up one morning. So this is just something I think about a lot, is where's the right place to begin the story. Okay, those are my 5 plotting essentials. Are there any questions about anything that I said? Or Tibby, do you have any questions?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
The first one is, can the character, especially one who gets in her own way, be both the protagonist and antagonist?
Yes, absolutely. We are often our own worst enemies, particularly in fiction and, well, in real life as well. My preference, though, is to have the character's inner conflict be one part of the conflict, but to also have some sort of external conflict coming from some other person, mainly because that gets your character in motion. What you want to avoid is a situation that becomes very internal, where all that happens is the character is just thinking about herself and her problems, because you're trying to engage the reader as well. So absolutely, every character should have some sort of internal conflict, but I would just also try and expand it by getting in an external one as well.
Okay, and another one is, how close to the beginning do you think the inciting incident should be? In other words, do you start right in the middle of it, or get to it at the end of the first chapter?
Yeah, I have to say, I would get that inciting incident going by the first chapter. Ideally, by the end of the first chapter, have something happen that kicks the story into gear. And I do a lot of editing work, and oftentimes when I edit, what I do is I basically just cut back the chapters till I get to the inciting incident. A lot of time you can just move that stuff deeper into the story. But keep in mind too that readers now have very little patience, unfortunately. They really want the story to get going. And honestly, I like a story that gets going too. If you're writing a short story, then I mean, this is, of course, there are no real rules in writing. And for everything I tell you, there's going to be somebody who's done the complete opposite and has done it very well. But if you're writing a short story, I usually figure that I'd like the inciting incident to take place by about the second page. So that's my arbitrary rule. That's not always right, but I don't think you go wrong with that.
Okay, thanks. And another question is, how do you deal with the saggy middle when many writers just get disgusted, give up on and or give up on the novel they're writing?
It's true. You get to page 140 and you're ready to tear your hair out. I mean, it's just, what do you do? Keep in mind that this is a good time to introduce new characters. Like, for example, in Maggie Dove, at around page 140, there's her antagonist actually is this police detective, the chief of police, who had been a banker in New York and now has come to her small little town. He retired with a lot of money. He's very sure of himself, and he happens to be a very upright sort of person. But unfortunately, he also thinks that the person who Maggie believes to be innocent is guilty. So he is driving her crazy. And what drives her particularly crazy is that she can't ignore him because he is a respect, she does respect him. That all happens around page 100 or so. So one thing I would suggest is the middle of the story is a perfect time to introduce somebody new. Have a new neighbor come into this thing who maybe offers some new conflict. Or another thing that can be good is I always like to have a holiday. If Maggie Dove takes place in April, but after Easter. But the novel I'm working on now takes place around Halloween. If I know that Halloween is going to take place on around page 100, then I can have my story build to that. And then you get Halloween and you have all that stuff to write about, and then all the other stuff. You might have a birthday, you can have an anniversary, you can have, I don't know why, but for some reason I find holidays to be very useful things to write around. So sometimes I think when people get to the sagging middle, they become locked into what it is they've been writing about. And it can be tremendously freeing to just say at that point, okay, something completely new can happen. Could be a news event too. I mean, maybe, or a hurricane or something like that. Weather is also a very good thing to happen. You're going about your business and all of a sudden there's a hurricane and then you have to deal with that. So yeah, I mean, those are sort of tricks that I use to, but the other thing I would say is the more you know your character, the less likely you are to have a sagging middle. So for example, if I know that Madeline is really interested in hip hop, say, when I get to the middle, then I can have a hip hop concert come up, and she's going to bring Jason to that. So the more you know, the less likely you are to run into that problem. Does that help?
Thanks. Does anybody else have any questions? I don't see any, but we'll be on for a couple minutes in case anybody has any. I thought it was really interesting what you said about the ending, the 4 choices.
Right.
And the first one you pick often is not the one you want.
Right. It's true. You tend to fall into something that maybe is a little obvious, and it's always nice if you can have some sort of surprise at the end. Not a surprise like an O. Henry surprise, it doesn't have to turn out something completely surprising, but if you can have something that maybe just gives you a little bit of a jolt. Like even when I was thinking about the endings for this, and I thought, what if he had a twin brother? Now, maybe that would be sort of silly, but it gave me something to think about, because if not a twin brother, well, maybe he had a friend. Like maybe the reason he went to jail was to protect a friend. That gives me all sorts of other things to think about. So it's good to keep in mind that there's more than one ending. There is, there are usually several different endings. Well, that's true in life too, I think, right? Like things can go several different ways, and you want to think about all the different ways it can go.
Great. And I see a question from someone who joined late and heard me say something about handouts. I sent the handouts to the email address where you signed up. If you did not get them, I will make a note of this and make sure you do, because I know who this person is.
Okay.
And are there any other questions for Susan?
While we're thinking about it, I just thought I'd say a word about writing mysteries, because one of the fun things about writing a mystery, particularly coming at it from literary fiction and worrying about plot so much, is that a mystery, the plot is kind of set out for you. You know that the inciting incident is probably going to be that somebody gets murdered. And you know that the protagonist, who is a detective of some kind, is going to have to solve that murder. And so what makes it nice is that if you are somebody who has a lot of difficulty plotting, you might want to try thinking of your novel as a mystery. I mean, in fact, all novels are sorts of mysteries, in that usually there's a secret involved. And so that's one way to look at it. But you might even try writing a mystery story as a good way to teach yourself how to plot, because there is something sort of very recognizable about a mystery plot. Murder, then problem, solve the crime, and so forth. And I have to say that part of the fun for me in writing a mystery is that it allowed me to take my mind off the plot a bit, because I usually spend so much time obsessing about plot that, because I knew the plot was somewhat predetermined, I could think about character more. So I think I probably had more fun writing this character than I would otherwise, just because I didn't need to worry about plotting so much. Of course, then you have all the clues and everything to worry about, which is a whole other concern. But I dealt with that.
And we have another question. Somebody says she enjoyed this immensely.
Oh, thank you.
Are there any essentials that would be different for a short story versus a novel?
Well, you have much more room in a short story to be experimental. If somebody reads a 300-page novel, their expectations are going to be different than for a short story. So yeah, I mean, one of the things I say about short stories concerns the ending, and that is that often short stories will have a more subtle ending than a novel. If you read 300 pages, you want to know how it ended. I mean, it's frustrating if you get to the end of a novel and you have no idea what was going on. But in a short story, you can be a little more murky about it, because you're dealing more with a moment. So oftentimes a short story will go more toward an ambiguous ending, somebody looking into space, somebody reaching out their hand. So that's one way in which a short story might be different. Also, although I didn't really talk about it that much in talking about plotting, but there's the whole issue of transformation. It's more of a character thing probably, but over the course of a novel, the character is probably going to be transformed in some significant way. So if we think of our Madeline Snow, for example, by the end of all this, I would think she would come to terms with what she thinks about love. But in a short story, the transformation is likely to be more subtle. You're not dealing with a huge story. You're dealing with a moment in somebody's life, and maybe it'll be part of a longer transformation, but it also allows you to, you know, you don't need to worry about that so much. Short stories, I think in general, are much more open to testing out things. My boss at Gotham Writers is of the view that everyone should write short stories before they write novels. And I don't entirely agree with that, because I think that there are people who are born to write novels and they don't want to write anything else, and I think that's fine. But a great thing about a short story is that it's less of a commitment of time usually. So it does allow you to experiment with plotting points in a way that you can't experiment with in a novel. You might not want to spend 7 years working on a novel only to discover you don't like the plot. But if you spend a month working on a short story and you don't like the plot, that's not so bad to deal with.
Great, thank you. And and I've got some feedback here all of a sudden. I don't see any other questions. So do you have any last words of wisdom to leave us with, Susan?
Well, I guess one thing I would say is that the best way to learn about plot, I think, is to read books, to read novels, and particularly to find the sort of novel that you like and take apart how it's been plotted. So, for example, I really like The Accidental Tourist by Ann Tyler. That book was just a tremendous influence on me. And what I did was, I forget now how many chapters it has, but say it's 38. I took it apart chapter by chapter and looked to see where, where various things happened, where the inciting incident was, what she had happened chapter by chapter, and that was a tremendous help. You may love The Da Vinci Code, for example, which is a very exciting plot. If that's the sort of book you're writing, then you want to read lots of books like the Da Vinci Code, because you almost program your mind to think like that. So alternatively, if you like much more obscure sorts of plots, then you want to read people like that. And then you want to read writers who are doing more experimental things. But I'm a big believer in learning. You don't have to start at ground zero. There are a lot of writers out there doing work that you can learn from. So I would go out, pick a book to read, tear it apart, and let that inspire you. Those are my final words.
Thank you all for joining us today. And I know I learned some things. I bet other people did too. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you, Judy.